Welcome back, everyone. Today we're going deep on a topic that's both fascinating and a bit spooky. Livonian werewolves.
Ooh.
Yeah, Livonia, for those who don't know, is present-day Latvia and Estonia. And for centuries, it had this reputation as, like, the werewolf hotspot of Europe. So we've got a ton of sources, scholarly treatises, travelogues, even trial records,
Wow.
all dating from the 16th to 18th centuries. So we're going to see how these beliefs took root, what they tell us about this really kind of turbulent period in history.
Well, what's interesting is that Livonia during this time was a place of really stark social divisions and a lot of warfare. You had these German elites ruling over the indigenous Estonian and Latvian serfs. It was a very tense atmosphere.
So imagine this, you're in 16th century Europe,
Yeah.
and suddenly these reports start popping up about these werewolf creatures running rampant in Livonia. And so naturally, scholars across the continent are trying to figure out what's going on.
Right.
Like, what is the deal with this?
Well, one of the first mentions that we see in European literature is in Sebastian Münster's Cosmographia. This is from 1550. He cites a report by Johannes Hassentutter, a scholar who traveled to Livonia.
Okay.
And it's interesting because Münster believed the werewolf transformations were delusions, but he still linked them to sorcery and witchcraft,
Right.
which kind of, I guess, set the stage for how werewolves would be perceived in the coming years.
It's like they couldn't quite shake that supernatural element completely.
Exactly.
Even though they're like, oh, it's just a delusion. It's like, well, but it's a supernatural delusion. So
Right.
there's still this element of, I don't know, the otherworldly,
Right.
something we don't quite understand going on.
Yeah. And then, just 5 years later, Olaus Magnus publishes his account. He was an exiled Swedish bishop,
Okay.
and his version is much more dramatic.
Okay.
He describes werewolves rampaging through villages during Christmas, breaking into homes,
Oh, no.
and get this, drinking all the beer.
What?
Yeah.
Werewolves love beer. That's what I'm hearing.
That's what Magnus says. He even suggests that anyone can become a werewolf through a ritual involving beer and magic words.
Wait, so like, hold on. Could you just accidentally become a werewolf if you said the wrong thing and had too much beer?
I mean, that's what Magnus seems to be implying.
That's a little frightening.
Yeah, it's a little concerning. But you got to remember, in that time period, beer was often associated with pagan rituals and folk magic.
Okay.
So by linking werewolves to beer, Magnus is kind of tapping into that existing folklore and those anxieties surrounding older pre-Christian beliefs.
It's almost as if the werewolf becomes a symbol of everything unsettling, everything disruptive to the established order.
Absolutely. Now, as these stories about Livonian werewolves spread, it triggers a wave of debate among scholars. For centuries, intellectuals across Europe are grappling with this question. What is the real nature of these creatures? Are they delusions,
Yeah.
a trick of the devil, or an actual physical transformation?
It sounds like a real intellectual tug of war.
It was. Some scholars, like Paul Einhorn, a 17th century theologian, believed werewolves were illusions created by the devil
Okay.
just to mock and tempt humanity.
So like a demonic prank.
Exactly.
That's a little messed up.
Right. And then you have others like Friedrich Meenius who put forward this, pretty outlandish theory
Okay.
that Livonian werewolves were actually descended from ancient Mesopotamians.
Wait, what?
Yeah. Who had migrated north.
Okay, I did not see that coming. Mesopotamians to werewolves? I don't quite follow the logic there.
I know, it's wild. But it just shows how much these scholars were struggling to fit these creatures into their existing historical and theological frameworks.
Right. So we've got one group saying it's all in their heads, another claiming they're demonic puppets, and then this whole migration theory. What about actual physical transformation? What were their arguments?
Well, that's where the Wittenberg humanists come in. Now, to give you some context, they were a group of scholars associated with the University of Wittenberg, which was a center of the Protestant Reformation in Germany.
Okay, yeah.
And they were really interested in these reports coming out of Livonia about werewolves.
Why Livonia specifically?
Well, Livonia was this mix of cultures. It had this reputation as kind of a wild frontier, and it just seemed to capture their imagination.
Okay,
One of the most notable figures was Philip Melanchthon.
okay.
He actually tried to connect Livonian werewolves to the ancient Scythian tribes,
Oh, wow.
which were mentioned by the Greek historian Herodotus.
Okay, yeah.
Now, this might seem like a stretch to us, but his reasoning was interesting.
Okay, I'm listening.
Herodotus described the Scythians as a nomadic people with these strong shamanic traditions. They had these rituals involving animal skins, trance states, which Melanchthon believed might be connected to the werewolf phenomenon.
So he's saying that these werewolf beliefs are, like, rooted in these ancient pagan practices that somehow survived into the 16th century.
Exactly. He saw it as a kind of cultural echo, a
Yeah.
remnant of these older ways of thinking about the relationship between humans and nature.
That makes sense, especially when you think about how back then the boundaries between the natural and supernatural were a lot more fluid,
Right.
not as clear-cut as we might think of them today.
Exactly.
And this idea that, anyone could potentially transform into a werewolf through rituals, I mean, that must have been terrifying to people back then.
Oh, absolutely. It
Mhm.
really speaks to that sense of vulnerability,
Yeah.
uncertainty, a fear that the world around them was not as stable and predictable as they thought.
Speaking of uncertainty, I remember reading about another fascinating figure among the Wittenberg humanists, Caspar Pusser.
Oh,
He
yes.
wrote about a werewolf who actually hunted witches.
Now that's where things get really interesting. It's one of the first times we see this concept of the good werewolf,
Hmm.
a protector figure who fights against evil.
So, not just a symbol of chaos and fear, but in some interpretations, almost heroic.
Exactly. And as we look closer at the experiences of the people in Livonia, we're going to see how this idea of the werewolf as a potential force for good really takes hold. But before we do that, let's shift gears a bit and look at what everyday life was like in Livonia during this time.
So, while these scholars are having these big debates about werewolves, what's the average person in Livonia thinking? Are they, like, constantly looking over their shoulder, worried about werewolves?
Well, that's where those travelogues come in.
Yeah.
And what's surprising is they often mention werewolves as just like a normal part of life in Livonia.
Really?
Yeah, it's almost as if they're just another animal listed in the local wildlife guidebook.
Like between the beavers and the rabbits.
Exactly.
Okay, that's a little unsettling.
Yeah, just casually reading a travel guide that warned you about potential werewolf encounters.
Yeah.
And what's even more interesting is that local scholars living in Livonia didn't seem as interested in werewolves as their counterparts elsewhere in Europe. Figures like Johann Canold, a naturalist, and even an anonymous traveler writing in the early 1700s dismissed these werewolf beliefs as just peasant superstition and tall tales.
So maybe it's a case of familiarity breeds, well, if not contempt, then at least a lack of intense fascination.
Right.
Like they were just so used to the idea of werewolves, they didn't think they were that special or scary.
That's a possibility. Or maybe they were just tired of outsiders constantly associating their homeland with these fantastical creatures.
Right, right. Like, oh, Livonia, that's where the werewolves are.
Exactly. But here's where things take a really fascinating turn. Remember how we talked about Caspar Pusser and his account of a werewolf hunting witches?
Yes, that whole good werewolf concept.
Right. Well, that idea seems to have resonated really deeply within Livonian folk beliefs.
Mm.
There's a student oration from 1615 by Heinrich von Uhlenbrock that mentions some Livonian werewolves actually consider themselves friends of God.
Friends of God. Yeah.
Yeah, fighting witches on his behalf.
So they're not just protectors from random attacks, but actively battling against evil forces, like holy warriors, but werewolves.
Exactly. And this idea becomes even more pronounced a few decades later in the trial of Old Thies in 1691.
Old Thies.
Yeah, he was a self-proclaimed werewolf who proudly declared himself a hound of God, fighting evil sorcerers.
Hound of God. Wow, that's a bold defense.
It is, and it really highlights this stark contrast between the scholarly view of werewolves as either delusions or demonic illusions, and this deeply rooted folk belief in them as potential forces for good.
It's almost like we're seeing two completely different understandings of the werewolf.
Exactly. It's like we're getting a glimpse into a hidden peasant counterculture.
A counterculture of werewolves.
In a way, yes. And it makes you wonder if this belief served a purpose beyond just explaining the unexplainable.
Okay, I'm listening.
Could it have been a way for those with little power, like the Latvian and Estonian serfs living under German rule, to find a sense of agency? Or even resistance within that rigid social hierarchy?
So, the werewolf becomes a symbol of rebellion.
It's possible. Remember, Livonia during this time was a place marked by stark social divisions and frequent conflict.
Right.
And the werewolf, with its ability to transcend boundaries, to shapeshift, to challenge expectations.
It could easily become this really powerful symbol for those who felt marginalized and powerless.
Precisely. And it's not just about social dynamics. Remember, this period also saw the Protestant Reformation sweeping through Europe.
Right, right.
Livonia was right at the heart of this religious upheaval. There were tensions rising between those embracing the new faith and those holding on to older traditional beliefs.
So anxieties about these changing religious landscapes might have contributed to these werewolf beliefs too.
Absolutely. The werewolf, this creature that blurs the lines between human and animal, sacred and profane.
It embodies all those anxieties about the unknown.
Exactly. The disruption of the familiar, the potential for chaos in a world that was changing so rapidly.
So the Livonian werewolf isn't just a monster lurking in the shadows. It's a reflection of a society grappling with immense social, political, and religious change.
Exactly. And as we move into the 18th century, we see how these beliefs start to decline, mirroring a shift in how people viewed the world around them.
So as we enter the 18th century, the Age of Enlightenment is in full swing. Did this new emphasis on reason and scientific inquiry change how people thought about werewolves?
Yeah, the Enlightenment really brought about a shift in thinking. The supernatural kind of started to lose its grip. With all that focus on logic and evidence, werewolves went from being these figures of terror and fascination to basically relics of a superstitious past.
So werewolves just disappeared, just like that.
Well, not entirely. But the way people explained werewolf sightings definitely changed. Enlightenment thinkers offered more naturalistic interpretations.
Okay, like what?
Well, they started attributing those supposed encounters to things like psychological conditions,
Oh, interesting.
like melancholy, vivid dreams, even the effects of bad weather on people's mental states.
So no more demonic illusions or ancient pagan rituals.
Not so much. The Enlightenment was all about demystifying the world, explaining things through reason and observation.
It's really amazing how these beliefs we've been talking about reflect the anxieties of their time.
It is, isn't it?
Like, we can see how those stories are connected to the social and political landscape.
Absolutely. And it really makes you think, what will future generations make of our own cultural narratives?
Right.
What will they learn about our fears and our fascinations?
It's like we're leaving behind a trail of breadcrumbs.
Exactly. And future historians will have to try to figure out who we were and what we believed.
Okay, so as we wrap up this deep dive into Livonian werewolves, what's the big takeaway?
Even the most fantastical creatures can teach us about the human condition. By exploring these beliefs, we learn not just about monsters, but about ourselves, how people grapple with fear and uncertainty, how they deal with a changing world.
And even though the Livonian werewolves might be gone, the questions they raise are still relevant today. The power of belief, the nature of good and evil, the things that shape how we see the world.
If those 16th and 17th century Livonians projected their fears onto werewolves, I wonder, what creatures would emerge from our own anxieties?
It's definitely something to think about. So until next time, keep exploring, keep questioning, and maybe keep an eye out for any shadowy figures lurking in the moonlight. You never know what fascinating stories are waiting to be uncovered.